There is a peculiar tragedy in modern life. A man can spend his entire day surrounded by noise, and yet never once encounter himself. He moves from screen to screen, from laughter to distraction, from one harmless pleasure to another, believing all the while that he is merely resting, merely passing time, merely taking the edge off existence. But beneath this innocent routine lies a quieter and more uncomfortable truth. We are not always distracted because the world is loud. Often, the world is loud because silence would force us to listen. And there are few things more frightening than being left alone with one's own soul. To sit in stillness is to meet unfinished thoughts, unhealed wounds, unlived convictions, and the unsettling suspicion that we have become strangers to ourselves. So we escape. We call it entertainment, productivity, business, even self-care. We fill every empty corner of the day because emptiness feels like danger. Yet a man who cannot bear his own company will search endlessly for substitutes and call them happiness. The greatest prison is not a room with locked doors, but a life arranged so cleverly that one never has to ask, "Why am I running?" For sometimes the issue is not that we have lost focus, but that we have made an art of fleeing inward truth. Silence has become one of the most feared experiences of modern life, though few people would admit it. We often imagine fear as something dramatic, a storm, a failure, a public humiliation, a visible loss. Yet there is another kind of fear, quieter and far more revealing, the fear of being alone with our own thoughts. A man may walk confidently through crowded streets, speak boldly among friends, and manage the visible duties of life with great competence, while inwardly he trembles at the idea of sitting in a silent room with nothing to distract him. This is because silence is rarely empty. It is a mirror, and most men do not fear emptiness, they fear reflection. Noise is comforting not because it satisfies, but because it protects. It shields us from questions we would rather not answer. In the constant movement of daily life, one can avoid the deeper matters of the soul. The endless stream of messages, entertainment, conversations, and obligations creates the pleasant illusion that life is full, when often it is merely crowded. To be silent is to remove the covering. Suddenly the mind begins to speak. Forgotten disappointments return. Regrets we buried politely at the back of consciousness knock at the door. Convictions we have postponed demand attention. We remember promises we made to ourselves and quietly abandoned. We confront the possibility that much of what we call business is only a well-decorated form of avoidance. There is something profoundly unsettling about discovering that the person we have been avoiding most carefully is ourselves. We can blame circumstances, complain of lack of time, point to difficult people, or accuse the world of being too demanding. But silence is mercilessly honest. It reveals whether our exhaustion comes from noble labor or from the endless effort of escaping self-examination. This is why many people would rather be exhausted than still. Fatigue can be explained and even admired, stillness exposes. It is easier to say, "I am too busy," than to ask, "What am I afraid to face?" The modern world, with all its conveniences, has made this escape wonderfully accessible. One need not make great effort to avoid reflection. Distraction now arrives uninvited, carried in the pocket, glowing on the bedside table, waiting patiently for every moment of discomfort. Yet the soul was not made to live indefinitely in flight. A man cannot outrun himself forever. What is ignored does not disappear, it merely waits. The anxieties we refuse to examine often grow stronger in the dark. The insecurities we silence with entertainment return louder in the night. The conscience we drown in noise becomes heavier, not lighter. Escape offers relief, but never restoration. There is a peculiar irony here. We seek distraction to preserve peace, but peace is precisely what distraction prevents. True peace is not the absence of uncomfortable thoughts, but the courage to face them without collapse. It is born not from avoidance, but from reconciliation, with truth, with responsibility, with the unfinished parts of ourselves. Silence, then, is not the enemy. It is often the doorway. It is the place where illusion begins to weaken and honesty begins to breathe. It may feel harsh at first, because truth usually does, but there is mercy in clarity. A wound must be uncovered before it can heal. A crooked path must be seen before it can be corrected. Many people spend years searching for meaning in louder places, never realizing that what they seek is waiting in the stillness they keep postponing. To sit quietly, without performance or escape, is one of the rare acts of courage left to ordinary people. It is there that a man discovers whether he is living by conviction or merely by habit, whether he is at peace or merely entertained, whether he is truly free or simply well distracted. Comfort is rarely introduced as a danger. It arrives politely, wearing the appearance of reward, rest, and harmless pleasure. It does not announce itself as an enemy, it presents itself as relief. After a difficult day, a man tells himself he deserves ease. After disappointment, he seeks softness. After effort, he reaches for indulgence and calls it balance. None of these things seem sinful in themselves, and often they are not. The trouble begins when comfort ceases to be a visitor and becomes a ruler. There is a profound difference between rest and surrender, though the modern mind often confuses the two. Rest restores strength so that one may return to purpose. Surrender quietly persuades a man to abandon purpose altogether. One leaves you prepared for discipline. The other makes discipline seem unreasonable. Comfort becomes dangerous not when it refreshes the body, but when it begins to govern the soul. The soul, left unchecked, has an unfortunate tendency to worship ease. It prefers the familiar over the necessary, the pleasant over the meaningful, the immediate reward over the distant good. This is not because man is weak by accident, but because there is within him a constant conflict between appetite and calling. One part longs for growth, truth, and sacrifice. Another part whispers that tomorrow would be a better day to begin. Comfort speaks in a gentle voice. It does not command, it suggests. Stay a little longer in bed. Delay the difficult conversation. Postpone the work that matters. Avoid the risk of failure by never attempting anything that might expose weakness. It is subtle enough to sound like wisdom. It calls procrastination peace, cowardice caution, and laziness self-care. The danger is not that comfort feels bad, but that it feels justified. Vice is easy to resist when it appears ugly. It is far harder when it arrives disguised as kindness toward oneself. A man may spend years defending habits that are quietly diminishing him simply because they seem harmless. The tragedy is not in dramatic ruin, but in slow erosion. Character is rarely destroyed in a single decision. It is softened gradually by repeated permission. This is why comfort can become an addiction. Not always to luxury, but to the avoidance of discomfort itself. One begins to organize life around the principle of least resistance. Hard truths are ignored because they disturb peace. Difficult responsibilities are postponed because they create tension. Personal growth is delayed because transformation is almost always inconvenient. The man addicted to comfort may still appear successful. He may be productive, respected, even admired, but inwardly he has become dependent on ease. He cannot tolerate silence, criticism, uncertainty, or challenge without immediately reaching for escape. He does not seek happiness so much as the absence of discomfort, and these are not the same thing. Happiness often requires discipline. Comfort demands only compliance. Happiness may ask for honesty, patience, and courage. Comfort asks merely that one remain undisturbed. One builds a life, the other decorates a cage. There is something especially deceptive about comfortable unhappiness. A person may remain in an unfulfilling life simply because it is familiar. He may stay in habits that weaken him because they ask nothing new of him. Misery, if predictable, can feel safer than freedom. The unknown appears threatening, even when the known is quietly destructive. Growth almost always begins with discomfort. To learn requires humility. To change requires loss. To become stronger requires resistance. Even love demands inconvenience, for genuine love is not built on ease but on sacrifice. A life devoted entirely to comfort cannot sustain any of these things, because it treats discomfort as proof that something is wrong, rather than evidence that something meaningful is happening. The question is not whether comfort should exist, but whether it should be obeyed. A chair is useful, a throne is dangerous. Comfort makes a poor master because it never asks what is right, only what is easiest. And the easiest path, followed long enough, often leads a man far away from the person he once hoped to become. There is a peculiar dignity attached to business in the modern world. A man who is constantly occupied is assumed to be important, responsible, perhaps even admirable. We ask one another how life is going, and the respectable answer is almost always the same: busy. To be overwhelmed has become a badge of seriousness, while stillness is often mistaken for laziness. Yet beneath this praise of productivity lies a dangerous confusion, for not all movement is progress, and not all activity is purpose. A man may fill every hour of his day and still avoid the one thing he most needs to face. He may answer every message, attend every obligation, complete every small task, and yet remain strangely absent from his own life. The world applauds efficiency, but efficiency is only useful when one is moving in the right direction. To run quickly down the wrong road is not success, it is merely faster wandering. Distraction often survives by borrowing the language of responsibility. It does not always appear as obvious laziness or indulgence. More often it disguises itself as useful work. We rearrange, organize, respond, prepare, and plan endlessly, while postponing the deeper labor that requires courage. We answer 10 trivial demands to avoid the one important question. We become experts in maintenance and strangers to meaning. This is why productivity can become a remarkably sophisticated form of escape. It allows a man to feel virtuous while remaining untouched. He can tell himself he is working hard, and perhaps he is, but effort alone does not guarantee honesty. Sometimes business is not discipline at all, it is fear wearing respectable clothes. There are tasks that require only energy, and there are tasks that require soul. The first can be done almost automatically. The second demand confrontation, with failure, uncertainty, vulnerability, and truth. It is easier to clean the desk than to begin the work one is afraid might reveal inadequacy. Easier to check another notification than to sit with the possibility that one's life is drifting. Easier to remain occupied than to ask whether occupation has become a substitute for direction. Modern life makes this especially convenient. There is always something to do, and nearly all of it can feel urgent. The trivial now arrives dressed as emergency. We are pulled toward constant reaction, and reaction creates the comforting illusion of importance. Yet urgency is not the same as significance. A man can spend years responding to what is immediate and never attend to what is essential. The soul suffers in such conditions because it was not made merely to manage existence, but to examine it. Human beings are not machines designed only for output. We require reflection, repentance, imagination, and intention. Without these, life becomes a series of completed tasks without a coherent self behind them. One may achieve much and yet remain inwardly unfinished. There is also pride hidden in compulsive productivity. To remain endlessly occupied can spare us the humility of admitting uncertainty. As long as we are doing something, we need not confront whether we are doing the right thing. Motion protects us from the embarrassment of stillness, where deeper questions rise: why am I doing this? Who am I becoming? What if success itself is distracting me from truth? These are dangerous questions because they threaten the comfortable arrangement of our routines. They may require change, apology, sacrifice, even the abandonment of carefully constructed identities. And so we stay busy. We call it ambition when sometimes it is avoidance. We call it discipline when sometimes it is fear of silence. Real productivity is not measured by exhaustion but by alignment. It is the union of action and purpose, labor and conviction. It asks not merely whether something is getting done, but whether the thing being done deserves one's life. A full schedule can be a sign of devotion, but it can just as easily be evidence of evasion. The greatest danger is not idleness, but unconscious activity, the habit of moving so constantly that one never notices where the movement leads. A distracted life often looks impressive from the outside, because noise is easier to admire than clarity. But a man who is forever occupied may discover too late that he has spent his strength preserving a life he never truly chose. Pain is one of the few experiences that refuses to be ignored, and for that reason, it is one of the most powerful teachers in human life. Yet modern man has become remarkably skilled at treating pain not as a messenger to be understood, but as an interruption to be silenced. We do not ask what sorrow is trying to reveal, we ask only how quickly it can be removed. Discomfort has become something to escape at once, as though its very presence were proof that life has gone wrong. This instinct is understandable. No one naturally welcomes suffering. A wound, whether of the body or the soul, demands relief. But there is a dangerous difference between healing pain and fleeing from it. Healing requires attention, escape requires only distance. One leads to growth, the other to repetition. What is refused in one season often returns in another, only louder and more difficult to ignore. Pain has a peculiar honesty. It strips away performance. A man can hide pride beneath success, insecurity beneath humor, loneliness beneath noise, but suffering tends to expose what comfort allows him to conceal. It reveals attachments, fears, and false securities. It shows us where we have placed our hope, because pain often enters precisely where our idols stand. For this reason, pain is not merely an enemy. It is often a revealer. It points to fractures we would otherwise continue decorating. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why does rejection wound so deeply? Why does failure feel like annihilation? Why does silence become unbearable? Beneath these reactions are often hidden beliefs that worth depends on approval, that identity depends on achievement, that peace depends on constant distraction. Pain forces these assumptions into the light. Yet rather than examine them, we usually run. We escape into entertainment, appetite, endless work, shallow relationships, or endless self-improvement projects that never touch the real wound. We prefer anesthesia to honesty. It feels safer to numb the symptom than to confront the source. There is a tragic irony here. The very pain we are trying to avoid is often the doorway to the maturity we claim to desire. Courage is not formed in ease, but in resistance. Patience is not learned in abundance, but in waiting. Compassion grows not from theory, but from suffering rightly endured. Character is rarely built in comfort. It is shaped where comfort fails. To avoid pain entirely is not to preserve life, but to remain undeveloped. A seed cannot become a tree by protecting itself from the dark soil. Growth always involves a kind of breaking. The old self must be challenged if the stronger self is to emerge. What feels like loss is often the beginning of transformation. This is why the fear of pain can become the enemy of growth. A man may remain in shallow habits because change is uncomfortable. He may avoid truth because truth demands surrender. He may cling to familiar misery because unfamiliar freedom feels too uncertain. Pain, in such cases, is not the obstacle to life but the passage into it. There is also a moral danger in constant escape. It teaches the soul to distrust difficulty itself. Every inconvenience becomes an injustice, every challenge a reason to retreat. One begins to believe that peace means never being disturbed. But peace built on avoidance is fragile. It survives only as long as reality remains polite. Real peace is stronger. It does not depend on the absence of pain, but on the willingness to meet pain without losing oneself. It understands that suffering can refine rather than destroy. It accepts that some wounds must be felt before they can be healed, and some truths must be faced before they can be forgiven. The soul grows stronger not by escaping every storm, but by learning what the storm reveals. Pain asks whether we are built on illusion or substance, whether our convictions survive discomfort, whether our values are ornaments or foundations. To flee these questions is to remain spiritually unformed. Many people spend their lives trying to protect themselves from every form of inner discomfort, never realizing they are also protecting themselves from wisdom. The wound they keep avoiding may be the very place where honesty begins, where pride is humbled, where dependence is corrected, where a truer self is waiting to be born. There is a strange and quiet tragedy in becoming a stranger to oneself. It does not happen suddenly, nor does it announce its arrival with any great drama. A man does not wake one morning and discover that he has lost himself as one notices a missing object. It happens gradually through small betrayals, repeated silences, and the steady habit of living outwardly while neglecting the inward life. One day he realizes he has been performing existence rather than inhabiting it. To know oneself is not merely to be aware of preferences, talents, or opinions. It is to understand the deeper architecture of the soul, the fears that govern decisions, the desires that shape habits, the convictions that either guide or abandon us in private. Many people spend years learning how to appear successful, agreeable, and admirable, yet remain almost entirely unfamiliar with their own motives. They know how to answer others, but not how to answer themselves. This estrangement often begins with compromise so small it appears harmless. A truth is ignored for the sake of convenience. A conviction is postponed because obedience feels costly. A desire for approval becomes stronger than the desire for honesty. At first these seem like ordinary accommodations to life. But every repeated compromise teaches the soul something. It learns that comfort matters more than integrity, appearance more than substance, acceptance more than truth. The danger is not simply moral failure, but inward division. A person begins to live in fragments. There is the public self, polished and presentable, and the private self, carrying unspoken disappointments and neglected questions. The distance between these selves widens until sincerity itself becomes difficult. One no longer knows whether actions are chosen from conviction or merely from habit and expectation. This is why so many people feel exhausted without understanding why. It is tiring to live divided. Pretending requires energy. To maintain an image while ignoring reality creates a quiet but constant strain. The soul resists falsehood, even when the mind has grown accustomed to it. There is fatigue in becoming someone one does not fully respect. Distraction makes this easier to ignore. As long as life remains noisy enough, one can postpone self-recognition. Business covers emptiness. Entertainment softens discomfort. Achievement creates the illusion that inward confusion is irrelevant. Yet success does not solve estrangement. A man may gain admiration from the world and still feel privately unknown to himself. There is also fear in self-knowledge, because to know oneself honestly is to encounter things one would rather avoid. Pride is less attractive when named. Resentment loses its nobility under examination. Excuses sound weaker in silence. It is often easier to remain vaguely dissatisfied than to discover the specific truths that demand change. Yet avoidance has its own cost. A person who cannot face himself becomes dependent on external definitions. He needs applause to feel valuable, because he has not learned to stand on conviction. He needs constant stimulation, because stillness threatens exposure. He becomes vulnerable to every opinion, every trend, every shifting expectation, because there is no stable inner ground from which to live. Freedom requires self-knowledge. Not the flattering kind, but the honest kind. A man must know what masters him before he can resist it. He must recognize where fear speaks louder than principle, where appetite rules under the disguise of reason, where pride has quietly rewritten morality in its own favor. Without this honesty, he remains governed by forces he refuses to name. There is mercy in this recognition. To discover one's own contradictions is painful, but it is also the beginning of integrity. The stranger can become familiar again. The divided life can be made whole. But this requires more than vague reflection. It requires the courage to stop performing and begin examining. It asks for confession, responsibility, and the willingness to disappoint false versions of oneself. Most people fear losing themselves, when in truth many have never fully met themselves at all. They have inherited routines, borrowed ambitions, repeated inherited definitions of success, and called this identity. But identity is not assembled from approval, it is formed where truth and choice meet. To become oneself is often less about invention and more about returning to the convictions once silenced, to the honesty once postponed, to the person buried beneath years of adaptation and escape. Freedom is one of the most misunderstood words in modern life. It is often imagined as the absence of restriction, the ability to do whatever one pleases, whenever one pleases, without interference or obligation. We call a man free when no one tells him what to do, when his choices are unlimited, when his desires meet no resistance. Yet this idea, though attractive, is often little more than polished slavery. For a man who obeys every impulse is not free, he is ruled by whatever shouts loudest within him. There is a difference between liberty and surrender to appetite. The first requires mastery, the second requires only permission. A person who cannot refuse himself is not exercising freedom but dependence. He may call it choice, but if he is unable to choose otherwise, the language of freedom becomes a disguise for bondage. This is why facing oneself is the beginning of real freedom. Until a man understands what governs him, he remains quietly controlled by it. The habits he excuses, the fears he avoids naming, the comforts he refuses to question. These become invisible chains precisely because they feel familiar. Slavery is most effective when it is mistaken for personality. Many people live under the rule of things they would never openly call masters. Approval governs them, so they shape their lives around being liked. Fear governs them, so they avoid every path that risks failure. Comfort governs them, so discipline feels like cruelty. Distraction governs them, so silence becomes unbearable. They speak of independence while arranging their entire existence around the avoidance of discomfort. To face oneself is to interrupt this arrangement. It is to ask not merely what one wants, but why one wants it. It is to examine whether desire is leading toward truth or merely away from pain. Such questions are unwelcome because they expose the possibility that much of what feels natural is simply practiced escape. There is a peculiar humility required in self-confrontation. One must admit that the enemy is not always outside. We are fond of blaming circumstances, difficult people, unlucky timing, and an unfair world. These things are real enough, but often the deepest obstacles are inward. Pride, cowardice, resentment, vanity. These are harder opponents because they travel under our own name. It is easier to fight chains we can see than those we have learned to decorate. Yet without this honesty, discipline becomes impossible. A man cannot govern what he refuses to acknowledge. He cannot change habits he insists are harmless, or heal wounds he insists do not exist. Freedom is not found in pretending weakness is strength, but in recognizing weakness clearly enough to resist it. This resistance is not glamorous. It often looks like ordinary, uncelebrated choices, sitting in silence instead of reaching for noise, telling the truth when performance would be easier, accepting discomfort rather than fleeing it, choosing responsibility over appetite. These are small acts, but character is built in such places. Great freedom is usually the result of small obediences repeated long enough to become identity. There is also sacrifice involved, because every genuine freedom requires the death of some lesser attachment. One cannot be free from approval while worshipping applause. One cannot be free from comfort while treating inconvenience as injustice. One cannot be free from distraction while fearing solitude. Something must be surrendered for something greater to be gained. This is why many prefer the familiarity of bondage. Chains once known can feel safer than uncertainty. A life of escape may be shallow, but it is predictable. Real freedom demands responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. It means no longer blaming every unhappiness on the world, but asking what part of the prison was built by one's own hands. Still, there is dignity in that burden, because responsibility restores agency. The man who faces himself discovers that he is not merely a victim of appetite or circumstance. He is capable of refusal, capable of repentance, capable of becoming different. This is not easy hope, but it is real hope. To face oneself is painful because illusions rarely leave politely. But it is also the place where strength begins. A person becomes free not when life grows easier, but when truth becomes more important than comfort. The soul that can stand honestly before itself, without disguise or escape, has already stepped beyond the prison most people spend their lives defending.